All right, all right, all right. Is everything good? You can see me and hear me because the
Can see
feedback
you,
I'm here.
can hear you, and can see the slides.
All right, fantastic. Because the feedback I'm getting here is a little weird. All right. So who's having a great UX South Africa? So hope everybody's enjoying it. It's a great conference. I do want to point out this is my fourth one. I did two in Joburg and one in Cape Town, and of course this one is virtual, and they've all been fantastic. So I want to thank Iggy and Theo for putting these things together and doing such a wonderful job with these. So one day I was relaxing after working on a project, and I was thinking about how incredibly valuable UX dog fooding was for what I was doing. And the thought occurred to me is it's like, dog fooding and UX, these are two words that rarely go together. And a quick Google search confirmed that. So I thought, well, this is kind of uncharted territory. This would be a great UX conference talk. And one thing led to another, and here we are. So let's get started. I'm not assuming you know what dog fooding means necessarily, so I wanted to start with a definition. And so the definition I came up with is when a team uses when a team uses a product it is designing and developing as a user would during development. So that was my definition. I looked it up in Wikipedia. They had a different definition, and the key difference was they didn't put the during development part in. But I really think that's the essential part, because that's really what we're talking about, is while we're building a product, we're actually using it ourselves as a user would. After the product is done, that's not really so much dog fooding. I guess you could call it dog fooding, but it really isn't what we're after here. It's during the design and development process. So a little history behind this term and why it's so weird. It was popularized by Microsoft. I actually worked at Microsoft for 10 years, so it's very much part of my DNA at this point. Apparently, historically, it all started in 1988, rather, when Paul Maritz, who was a executive at Microsoft, sent a executive email around saying that we need to eat our own dog food. And that kind of got the whole thing going. And David Cutler, who was the chief architect of Windows NT, was especially well known for making people dog food. So this is really very much a Microsoft thing, to be sure. Apparently the origin of the phrase comes from quite literally a dog food commercial. So apparently the Alpo brand in the US was talking about this, and also apparently the CEO of Calcan would actually literally eat dog food to kind of demonstrate how good it was. And I think dog fooding is very much a cultural thing. So your devs probably know what dog fooding is, but I imagine your UX design team probably has never heard of it. And so at this point, you're probably thinking, well, what's the big deal? I mean, come on, who cares? I mean, is this really that important or insightful of a thing? And so I'm willing to bet that half of you think, well, this is kind of obvious, right? And the other half of you are probably thinking, no, don't do this. Do not do this. This is a bad idea. We can't do this. So why would people think that? Well, if I had to guess on one design idea or foundation of what UX design is all about that we could all agree to, it's probably the idea that we are not our users. Users are not you. In fact, people have coffee cups, coffee mugs to remind themselves of this fact. So if you're thinking this through and you understand what this means, you might think, well, this is a crazy thing to do because we're not our users. So what difference does it make how we react to our own product? Because it just doesn't mean anything. We have to test with real users. Testing with ourselves would be a futile activity, right? Well, not to worry, no worries, mate. It's not going to be a problem. And here's why. If we break the problems down into two areas, false positives and false negatives, first, let's start with the false positives. So that would be a situation where we tested ourselves and we think, well, it's fantastic. It's wonderful. Everybody's going to love it. They're going to love it. It's great. Don't need to change a thing. Well, that's not what we're doing here. We're not doing this. If we were to do this, we would recognize that that is not a meaningful thing to do. What we're worried about is the problems. So that would be false negatives. So we find a problem in our app, and we think it's a problem because it's from our point of view, and it turns out that it's really not a problem for our target users. While that's possible, it's actually really unlikely. And here's some thinking behind that. So my overall observation here that I've made over the years is that when something sucks, quite frankly, it almost always sucks for everybody. It's not like there's one group that hates it and there's one group that really, really loves it. It's possible, but it's unlikely. So let's say, for example, you're testing your own product and you find something that's really annoying to you. Chances are, like 99%, your target users will also find it annoying. And if it turns out you're in that 1% category, well, not to worry, because remember all that great user research we've done and all that wonderful empathy we've built. We'll be able to recognize those situations, and they're probably very much by design. So we'll know about that stuff. So it's not like we're going to be horribly misled when we do this. So why is this important? Well, the fact is we're living in the real world, and in the real world, we have limited time, we have limited money, we have limited resources. There are all these things we'd love to do if we have the time to do them that we just can't do because that time and money and resources aren't there. It's just the fact of life. So another challenge we've got is that we want to minimize that feedback cycle, right? We want to get this as much feedback as we can, as quickly as we can, before we're overly committed to a certain design direction. And it turns out that dogfooding is in effect the shortest feedback loop there is. So there's a lot to be said for that. Another problem is that if we're depending upon user-based feedback, all too often users don't recognize problems. They just kind of accept it as it is. So if you give users something that's poorly designed, they might just assume, well, it's poorly designed, and they just take that for granted. They don't give you that feedback that they're not quite happy with it. Very often they blame themselves as well, right? They get something wrong, they do something wrong, repeatedly make the same mistake, and they're thinking, oh, well, I just keep forgetting to do whatever this thing is, not recognizing that it's not their fault, it's our fault. So they're not necessarily going to give us that feedback. Now, to be very clear, what I'm suggesting is that we dog food not as a replacement for anything that we're doing now, but as a supplement, that this will make our other activities better. And so my thinking here is that we don't want to use these big, expensive tools to find relatively simple, obvious problems, that we should be able to do these ourselves. And I very much consider user testing, usability testing, to be a very precious resource, not only in terms of time and effort required to do these things, and the fact of the matter is we don't do them that often, for most teams. But the reality is, for a lot of teams, they don't even have access to their users, or maybe they have very limited access. So for example, I'm working on one project where they basically have 3 users that they can test with. Once you've done that testing with that 3 users, you're kind of done, right? So it's not like we have infinite resources out there to do user testing. Another reason for why we need dogfooding is, quite frankly, we kind of suck at self-evaluation. We're just not good at these things. So, for example, design reviews, heuristic evaluations, expert evaluations. So I actually have a half-day workshop on design reviews, as well as a half-day workshop on heuristic evaluations. And I personally do a lot of expert reviews. By the way, there's a hint in there somewhere. But I can tell you that just seeing how a lot of teams do these, we're not doing them that well. We really have a ton of room for improvement with these things. Another challenge we have is that everybody's kind of focused on other stuff, right? So our managers, they're focused on budgets, they're focused on cost and scheduling. Our devs, totally focused on the code. If you're agile, they're focused on sprints and velocity and all that stuff. Feature owners, they're focused on getting their feature done, right? And of course, designers, we're focused on our screens and details about the features that we're responsible for. But the key question is, who's looking at the entire user experience as a user would on a daily basis? Now, if you're lucky, you might have a user researcher on your team. And if you do, you are lucky, because most teams, quite frankly, don't. That's not the typical situation. It's the exception rather than the rule. So if you've got a user researcher, they're probably doing this, so you're in better shape. But even if you do have a user researcher, here's the way I like to look at it. So you probably have seen this diagram before. This was devised by a guy named Robert Vierzy. Apparently everybody thinks that Jacob Nielsen came up with it because he posted about it on his blog. But it's by Robert Vierzy, so we should fix that. And so what's notable about this is that, of course, the standard interpretation is that if we test between 5 and 6 users, we're going to find about 80% of the usability problems. Another key data point on this is if we test 0 users, we're going to get 0 identified usability problems. So that's important as well. We need to do this, right? But I would make the claim that the Y-axis is mislabeled. It's not usability problems found. It's bloody obvious usability problems found. We're going to find the obvious stuff when we do a round of usability testing. So for the sake of argument, let's say we know that our app has, for example, 40 usability problems. And let's say that 10 of them are obvious. If we do a round of usability testing, maybe if we get that 80%, we'll find 8 obvious problems and maybe 2 or 3 other problems. So we might find 10 usability problems. We fix those 10, we do another round of testing. We're not going to find 0. We're going to find another 10. And we do another iteration, we're going to find yet another 10. We're going to find the most obvious problems because the obvious problems obscure the less obvious problems. So if we want to make this process as efficient as possible, and we don't have a lot of opportunity to do a lot of rounds of these, we want that first round or that second round to be as productive as possible. We don't want to spend this resource on finding obvious stuff. We want dogfooding or other techniques to do that. Now, if you're worried about, it's like, well, we just know too much, right? We're not our users. We know way too much about how our product works. Therefore, we cannot possibly do this because we're going to be so biased in our knowledge. I don't find that to be a practical problem. And here's why. There's 2 solutions to this. First is using scenarios, and the other is simply to assume nothing. So in terms of scenarios, what you want to do when you're doing dogfooding is basically choose a scenario. So choose a specific target user who has specific goals and they're working in a specific context. They're trying to get something specific done. So it's not random stuff. You're actually trying to do something real as a real user would. The other thing is to just simply have no knowledge in the head, right? So a few things to look for. If it's explained explicitly in the UI, there's a good chance that users will see it and do it. If it's a well-known interaction standard, there's a good chance that people will do it, even if it's not visible. However, by contrast, if something is not discoverable or doesn't have a clear, obvious affordance, users won't see it. It doesn't exist as far as they're concerned. And another thing to look for is that they're probably going to, or at least you should assume that they're going to interpret everything literally as written. And so whenever you're doing this, you constantly have to ask yourself the question, how do I know that? Do I know it because I designed the thing, or do I know it because the UI is telling me? It's a huge difference that we have to make. All right, so I'm going to talk about a medical app in a few moments, but just to work through an example of this last idea of literal interpretation. So let's just assume that the screen says, call your doctor now. All right, so my advice here is that we should assume that users will interpret this literally. So this means to users, call your doctor now. It doesn't mean consider calling your doctor eventually, but only if it makes sense based on factors that we're not going to tell you. Our users don't know that, right? So if it says call your doctor now, presume they're going to call their doctor now. However, the second bit is, well, we shouldn't assume that they're actually going to do it unless we make a very compelling case for doing so. So we have to look for that as well. So we need very persuasive evidence to do something that's relatively provocative, like calling a doctor. So we have to constantly ask ourselves, would I really do this based on what I'm seeing now? And if the answer is no, we've found a problem. All right, so what are the benefits of dogfooding? Well, it's cheap, it's easy, there's a very short feedback loop. We as designers know what is not by design, so we're better able to find those little mistakes that ended up in our app. And this next one I think is huge, right? It builds real empathy. We as designers, we're constantly talking about empathy, all the time. It's like empathy. It's so important to have empathy for our users. But I actually, personally, when I'm talking about this, I don't use the word empathy, I use the word understanding. I think it's all about understanding our users. And the reason I do this is I think we get a little too sidetracked by this idea of feelings. It's very difficult to find design for people's feelings. And if you don't agree with me, I just have one thing to say, which is show me the empathy. I want you to show me the empathy, because I'll tell you what, I'm not seeing it. Look at your typical design and show me what's empathetic about it. And you're not going to find a whole lot. Optimizing your conversion metrics is not empathy. Optimizing for SEO is not empathy. We do so many things that really are counter to empathy. And we talk about walking a mile in our customers' shoes, and we talk about it all the time. Talk, but we never actually bloody do it. The great thing about dogfooding is it literally actually, it's not literal. It's okay. It's literally, figuratively walking a mile in your customer's shoes. This is like the closest we'll actually get to doing this. It's not talk, it's doing, when you're actually using your own product as a user would. So this is the most empathy building thing we can possibly do. Another benefit to it is it enables long-term evaluation, right? Think about your typical user test. It's what, minutes, maybe an hour, something like that. You can dog food for months. This is a very long-term thing that's very impractical in your typical techniques otherwise. All right, who should dog food on your team? I think the best answer is everyone on your team. I actually think even better than the best answer is everyone on your team plus the executives. So just to work this through, I don't think this is necessarily a dog fooding example. I'm not totally sure if it was dog fooding, but if you're familiar with Adobe products, they've got all these different products, and the whole licensing thing was just a horrible mess, and they had a lot of complaints, and they wanted to get this fixed, and the executives were like, we're good, let's not worry about it. And so basically the strategy that the designers used was they said, you know what, all right, that's fine, but what we want you to do is we want you to actually do this yourself for a period of time and see how it goes. And if you still agree it's not a problem, we won't worry about it. And so they, of course, the execs tried it. It was a bloody nightmare. So that's how they ended up with the Adobe Creative Cloud solution to really put everything together in a usable way, because it was just such a chaotic mess beforehand. And it didn't really get anybody's attention until the execs did it. All right, one last practical tip here is that, what I find dog fooding is that technical debt is like the enemy of this, that technical debt, design debt. You're really finding all these little details that are just not quite right that you need to fix. And that only really works if it's pretty close to being clean. If everything is like severe technical debt or design debt, it's just way off, and you're dog fooding, you're just going to basically rediscover that debt and confirm that it's a problem. So it's not going to be as productive if you've got a lot of cleanup work to do. All right, so I describe this as adventures in UX dog fooding. So let's talk about the adventure part. So I do UX design training and consulting. So I've been doing this for 10 years. And interestingly, when I started off the first 8 years, it was almost exclusively focused on training. Last 2 years, it's pretty much flipped over. It's been focused almost exclusively on design work and consulting. And that turned out to be a good move COVID-wise. Training's kind of tough these days. So one of the projects I'm working on is a mobile healthcare app. And just to give you a little background on this, the app is designed for a illness that is fatal. So patients who are using this will probably die of this disease or some other comorbidity. So this is serious, right? The interesting thing about this being a medical thing is that it requires any sort of testing requires approval from an ethics board. You just can't go out and user test. You have to go through this formal process of getting approval, which is very time consuming and expensive to do. So testing, user testing, actual user testing with patients is a rare thing. And the interesting thing about this is we were actually doing that. We had approval. We're in the middle of this, and right smack in the middle of our testing, bang, COVID hit, and we had to stop right on the button there because we were not allowed to continue. So testing, in-person user testing, especially with elderly patients, is a very, very difficult thing, or impossible, quite frankly, right now. But great thing about dog fooding is we can do anything we want. There's nobody that we have to ask. We don't have to get any approval. We don't have to do anything. We can do anything we want with our own stuff. And so I actually not only designed it, I wrote the code for this as well. And I've been dog fooding it ever since January, once the code actually worked. I want to point out, by the way, I'm not the target user here. Given the last slide, that's a very good thing. But I don't have the problem, but I understand enough about the problem, and that's not that hard, to understand how to use the device effectively. So dog fooding basically boils down to you're supposed to use it every morning. It's supposed to be in the bathroom. So I get up, go to the bathroom, and I use the device every morning. And if everything works as expected, we're good. And if I find any little problems, I immediately fix them. So I've been doing this since January. And just to make a very provocative statement, at least for this project, is that although I love usability testing, it's fantastic, it's really important that we all do it whenever we can. If I had to choose for this project between usability testing and dogfooding, I'd go for the dogfooding. So I know that's a bold statement, so I want to back this up. So since I wrote the code, I was able to plow through it and look for all the changes that we've made. And so I looked for big changes that were made since the first bowl, because it's dogfooding, right? Actually, nobody calls it a bowl. I'm just messing with you here. But just going through it, in terms of user testing, we found 7 big problems, 3 of which I'm calling clever in the sense that they're not obvious at all, really required deep introspection, or not introspection, but deep thinking, let's say, to figure these problems out, let's say. In terms of, team ideas, just it's not, through testing, but just ideas that the team came up with. We had 9. Dogfooding myself, that was a total of 10, 5 of which were what I thought were clever. And target user, so in this situation, it was dogfooding, but it was someone who actually was a patient. So a member of the family, let's say. So that was a total of 6. So bottom line is, through dogfooding, we got 16 versus 7 through user testing. Now, when I was doing this, I was thinking, well, so the way I kept score was it had to result in a change. So that actually kind of underrepresents the value of user testing here. So I wanted to clarify this a little bit. So looking at all the things we came up with user testing, we did have deep insight into our users. We had a much better understanding of our users after the user testing than before, but those things did not necessarily result in a change in the app. So that's how I kept score. So just to kind of keep score a little bit better here, user testing found some problems, but gave us that deep insight, which might affect future design decisions or prevent us from making mistakes in the future. So that counts for something. It just didn't count for anything in this exercise here. Dogfooding, it's all about finding and fixing problems. There's no user insight in here, obviously, because it doesn't involve users. So my belief, though, is if I had skipped the usability testing, we probably would have found most of the problems that we ended up finding through testing. Whereas by contrast, I'm convinced that the clever problems that I found, we would probably have not found any other way and would have shipped that in the product. And so just to give you something real here, since I'm speaking abstractly, here's the situation. So we've got this device, it goes into the bathroom, and for a variety of reasons, it's very important that you do not turn this device off. So there's a lot of things that go wrong if you were to do that, including the fact that you might not remember to turn it back on the next day. So the problem, though, is that leaving it on all the time just seemed wasteful. It just seemed wrong, right? So you go in your bathroom in the middle of the day and the thing is on, you just want to turn it off. It just seems wrong to have it off because you don't need it. You only need it first thing in the morning. And at night, it's a huge distraction. You got this screen glowing in your bathroom. It's just totally, totally wrong. So the solution I came up with is that, you only have to use it once during the day. So after that is that one trial is done during the day, it turns itself off after a period of time. And then in the morning at a specified time, it wakes itself up. So that's simple enough. And by the way, another design challenge we had is we wanted to figure out how to remind users to use it, right? And it turned out that being turned on was like the perfect reminder. It was subtle, but incredibly effective. You walk into the bathroom, you see the screen on, it's like, oh, I have to remember to weigh myself or whatever. And then if it's off, it means you don't have to do it. You're good. So it turned out to be really, really great. This was a huge improvement, but the interesting thing is this is something that required like 2 days of dogfooding, because I immediately recognized, no, this is wrong. We can't do this. We have to do something different. Whereas by contrast, had we depended upon the more traditional means of getting user feedback, a usability study, or whatever, or even putting it in someone's home, there's a very good chance we would have never got that feedback. We just wouldn't, and it was just incredibly obvious using it yourself. Last slide here. So the question is, I'm talking about a medical device. It's on a tablet. It's in the bathroom. That's pretty easy to dog food, right? What about something really difficult to dog food? So I was thinking about my customers, and I've got one customer that is in the mass spectrometry business. And these are very sophisticated machines. They basically figure out how much of X is in Y using some sort of analysis technique called mass spectrometry. These devices are huge. They're extremely expensive. You know, you're not going to put this in your living room or your bathroom, right? So how could you possibly dog food something like that? So I thought that through, and I was thinking, well, you know what? We could do that, right? So what we could do is we could say, okay, team, we want a dog food. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get the best tech support UX problem of the week. And by best, I mean worst, like the worst thing that happened that week. We're going to assemble the team for whatever, half hour or whatever. And we're just going to try to replicate that problem ourselves and see what happens. Now, suppose we were to do that every week, once a week, every week for a year. At the end of the year, how much change would we have, right? How many easily fixable problems would we find? How much genuine user empathy would we build? How much higher of a bar would we have for our design decisions? How much higher of a bar would we have for trying to solve problems through documentation or training? I think after a year, the cumulative effect of doing this could be quite extraordinary. And that's certainly the experience I had with the app that I've been working on. All right, so let's wrap this up. So if you remember only 7 things from today, you know, it's the real world versus the ideal world, and we're living in the real world. Real world wins every time. We just don't have the time to do everything that we'd like to do, that we need to do. We just don't. So in this real world, practical things are really valuable. Things that are quick, easy to do, cheap to do, flexible, and now work well with COVID. And that's what dog fooding really is all about. I love the big tools. I love user research. I love usability testing, but those are relatively big tools to use. Let's try to use those as efficiently as possible, since they are a relatively scarce resource, and find the easy things other ways. Dog fooding is a supplement, not a replacement. I'm not saying we should stop doing anything if we dog food, but I am saying that if we dog food, we're going to do all these other things a little bit better. There's a few basic rules you've got to do. It's not that big of a deal. You know, really try to make it scenario based. Really put some thought into how you figure things out, and try to do it as a user would, rather than how you would as someone who already knows how everything works. Involve the whole team, especially your higher level managers, your execs, because that's going to get them on board with you. And it's really a fantastic way of building real user empathy. It's not talk, it's actually doing it. We're truly walking a mile in our customers' shoes. And then I think we can potentially dog food anything. It's just the harder ones require a little bit more creativity. All right, so let's eat our own dog food. I just snuck this slide in last minute. I was watching Don Norman's talk yesterday, and someone asked the question, are there any good resources on intuitive design? And there are 2 excellent resources on intuitive design. One is called Intuitive Design, 8 Steps to an Intuitive UI, and the other one is called UI is Communication. And it just so happens by pure coincidence that I wrote both of them. So the 8 steps is basically a great framework for thinking about what is intuitive or not. And then the UI is Communication. Basically, the concept there is that a UI is a form of human communication. So if we think about communicating effectively to our users, that makes things naturally intuitive because we understand how to communicate well. So let's not worry about the other stuff. Let's focus on effective communication, and that leads to better designs. So the book basically presents that philosophy and how to use it. All right, Leka. All right, so Iggy, do we have time for Q&A
Yes.
here? By the way, before
Yes.
I forget, love to connect on LinkedIn, and here's my email address if you want to get in touch through email.
So Everett, the first question we've got is, and this is from Sarah. In your experience, do you think dog fooding should be done before development in a prototype or during development using a staging environment?
That's a good question. So all my experience with dog fooding is it's with the real deal. It's and I think that that's what, maybe I should change that definition that I have, because I would say that any sort of evaluation that we do with a prototype isn't dog fooding, it's something else. It's a design review or some kind of review. It's not really truly dog fooding. So I think it's a different thing. I really do.
Okay. Then the next question, I really like this dog fooding thing, and this is from Monet.
Hey,
Thanks
Mo.
for unboxing your UX dictionary. If the term dog fooding equals obvious usability problems in design, what acronym do we have for the not so obvious usability problems in design? And do you have any example of it?
Well, so here's the thing. I said obvious many times here, but if you look at my stats, and I had the clever column there, actually I found a lot of things that weren't obvious, that really required a deep understanding of what we're trying to do with the app that we would have never found, or unlikely would have found other ways. So when I say obvious here, what I'm really saying is I don't want to make it sound like I'm exaggerating how effective this is. That my promise is that we will hopefully find the obvious problems, but there's a very good chance that we'll find not obvious problems as well. It's just a little less likely, right? That usually you really do need users to give you that insight, but it's certainly possible with dog fooding as well. So like the annoyance thing, I use that as like the first example. Something being annoying, if we design something and it turns out to be really annoying, it wasn't obvious, because if it were obvious, we would have never done it in the first place. So it's the real world use that makes that non-obvious thing obvious. So I think dog fooding is still that, but I'm using the word obvious here to not overpromise.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question, this is from Francis. How long should a dog fooding trial last?
Well, I don't know. That's a tough one. So like I said, I started this one in January, and here we are November, so that would be 10 months plus, right? That was never my intent, but in my particular case here, given the duration of this particular project, which is obviously long, plus the fact that it's just so quick and easy to do, it's just become part of my daily routine to use it. So this is probably more of an exception. Your typical project, you probably have to go out of your way a whole lot more than what I've been doing. Thinking about how it's done at Microsoft when I was there, which was, I left in 2010, so they were a little less agile back then. But that dog fooding period would be basically, it would start once you actually had something that was dog food worthy, and it would end once the product was shipped, and that could be an extended period of time as well. But I'll tell you what, just using that one example I gave you, which is the whole device putting itself to sleep idea, that one took 2 days to appreciate. And so Mr. Norman referred to the old the best is the enemy of the good thing. Depending upon your circumstances, there's a very good chance that you will find stuff that you wouldn't find as quickly any other way in, let's say, a 2-week dog food period. So the example I used was extended, and I think that really has helped a great deal. But even if I had 2 weeks, I wouldn't say, oh, it's not worth it because we don't have a lot of time. It's totally worth it.
Thank you. And then, this is from Monet as well. So his question starts off the record. Everett, what happened to your online webinars?
Yeah, so I was doing a free monthly UX webinar, and Mo was one of my most loyal participants. I stopped at the end of last year, and my plan was to try YouTube for a while. I haven't done that yet. I'm still thinking that bit through, but one of these days, real soon now, my intent is to start a YouTube channel and see how that goes. So that's why I stopped.
Okay. Thank you. That's the last of the questions. If you guys have any more questions, that's Everett's email address. We've also tweeted his handle, so please check out Twitter handles. Yeah, thank you so much, Everett, for the talk again.